The best of the best. The stars glittered brightly above, scattered across the dark expanse of space like diamonds on a velvet cloth. It was a calm and perfect day in the Galactic Council chamber, one of the most prestigious places in the galaxy. The room was vast, its walls made of shimmering metallic alloys that reflected the light from nearby stars. Alien beings of various shapes, sizes, and colors gathered, each representing the best of their species. They were the leaders, the thinkers, the inventors. They were the finest minds from every corner of the galaxy. And today, they were about to discuss the most important weapon ever created. But this wasn't just another council meeting. It was one where the fate of the galaxy itself hung in the balance. In the center of the room stood a massive, complicated machine, the most powerful weapon in the known universe. This weapon, capable of erasing entire planets from existence, had been constructed by the best engineers, scientists, and strategists from all over the galaxy. It was intended to be the galaxy's ultimate deterrent, a weapon so advanced and so unstoppable that no one would dare challenge the great civilizations of the galaxy. And yet, it had failed. The weapon was nothing but a hulking, malfunctioning piece of machinery now. The alien engineers who had designed it, the ones who were supposed to be the best at what they did, were baffled. They couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. They had tried everything: fixes, adjustments, restarts. But no matter what they did, the weapon refused to work. The faces in the council chamber were filled with frustration and confusion. These were beings who had mastered technology and science beyond the imagination of any human. Yet, here they were utterly helpless. The weapon was supposed to be their ultimate tool, their answer to any threat. But instead, it had become a burden, a failure. And the worst part was that they couldn't fix it. The head engineer, a towering creature with 3 eyes and skin that shimmered like liquid metal, looked over the council members, his face twisted with worry. "We have exhausted all options," he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "This weapon, it cannot be repaired. We are at a loss." The others in the room exchanged glances. There were mutters of disbelief. How could this happen? The weapon was supposed to be the pinnacle of their collective genius, the greatest creation the galaxy had ever known. And yet it was broken. "We were so sure it would work," another engineer added. "We spent decades designing it, testing it, perfecting every detail. How could we have missed something so critical?" A hush fell over the room as the gravity of the situation sunk in. For all their advancements, for all their achievements, they had created something that had failed them. And now, the galaxy's future was at risk. As the room buzzed with worry and frustration, a human figure entered the chamber, seemingly out of place among the towering alien beings. His name was Captain Jake Barnes, a simple mechanic who had earned his reputation by fixing broken engines, machines, and even some of the most sophisticated spacecraft in the galaxy. But today, he wasn't here to fix a ship or a piece of equipment. He was here to fix the galaxy's greatest failure. Jake stood calmly at the entrance of the room, his dark eyes scanning the chamber. He had been summoned because of one reason. The alien engineers had run out of options, and the council had no other choice but to turn to the only species that had never failed when faced with a challenge: humans. At first glance, he didn't seem like much. He wasn't towering or imposing like the alien beings in the room, and he didn't have any of the advanced technology that they possessed. He was just a man, dressed in a simple mechanic's uniform. But what the aliens didn't know was that Jake wasn't just any mechanic. He was someone who had an uncanny ability to fix things when no one else could. The aliens looked at him with skepticism. How could this human, with no experience in advanced alien technology, possibly fix a weapon so complex, so powerful? It was an impossible task. But Jake wasn't fazed. He had dealt with impossible situations before. He had spent his life working on engines, machines, and systems that others had given up on. Fixing things, no matter how broken, was in his blood. He had a unique way of thinking, a way of seeing problems differently, a way that no one else seemed to understand. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but confident as he spoke. "I can fix it." The room fell silent. The alien engineers stared at him in disbelief. Had he really just said that? They had tried everything, and now this human was going to fix it. It was absurd. One of the alien leaders, a being with smooth purple skin and elongated limbs, scoffed. "You think you can do what the finest engineers in the galaxy could not? This is a weapon of unimaginable complexity. There is no way a human could understand it, let alone repair it." But Jake didn't back down. He simply looked the leader in the eyes and repeated, "I can fix it." The council chamber erupted into murmurs of doubt. Some of the alien engineers shook their heads, dismissing Jake as just another naive human. Others whispered among themselves, clearly unconvinced that this human could possibly succeed where their brightest minds had failed. But the council had no other options. They were desperate. And so, after a long moment of silence, they agreed. "You may try," one of the council members said, his voice filled with skepticism. Jake didn't waste any time. He moved toward the weapon, his hands already reaching for the alien machinery. The engineers watched him closely, waiting for him to make a mistake, to prove them right. But Jake wasn't just another human. He had something they didn't: determination. And it was that determination that would drive him to do what no one else could. As he began to examine the weapon, he knew that this wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about proving something. It was about showing the galaxy that humans could do what no one else could. They might not have the technology, the experience, or the advanced understanding of alien systems, but they had something even more powerful: resilience. The weapon was big, complicated, and foreign to him, but Jake had worked with machines all his life. He wasn't intimidated. He knew that no matter how complex it was, every system had a pattern. Every machine had a way of working, and it was his job to find that pattern, to unlock it, and to make the impossible happen. And so, with nothing but his wits, his hands, and his unshakable belief in himself, Jake Barnes began the work that would change everything. Jake stood in front of the massive weapon, his hands running over the sleek surface of the machinery. It was nothing like any human-made technology. The surface was smooth, almost organic, and pulsed with an eerie glow. Despite the complexity of the device, Jake didn't hesitate. He could feel his pulse steady as he focused on the task at hand, blocking out the murmurs of disbelief from the alien engineers and the council members around him. They had all watched, waiting for him to fail. There was no way a human, with no understanding of their advanced alien technologies, could possibly fix something as intricate and powerful as the weapon. And yet, Jake wasn't worried. The weapon had failed, but Jake didn't see it as a dead end. To him, it was a puzzle, something waiting to be understood. He had always been good at puzzles. As a mechanic, he learned to see beyond the obvious. He could break down any machine into smaller parts, find what was wrong, and fix it. And this weapon, no matter how advanced, was no different. He took a deep breath, and his fingers started to move, gently tapping the panels and reading the lights flashing in front of him. It wasn't about brute force. It was about patience. The aliens had tried to find the flaw using logic and their advanced understanding of science. But Jake knew that sometimes the answer didn't come from looking harder at the problem. It came from looking at it differently. The engineers, once confident in their superiority, now stood in silence as Jake's hands moved with precision, carefully inspecting each segment of the weapon systems. Some of the engineers couldn't help but glance at each other in confusion. How could this human be so calm? How could he touch the weapon like he understood it, as if it wasn't the massive, incomprehensible creation that they had labored over for so long? Jake was familiar with technology in a way they could not comprehend. While the alien engineers saw machines as elaborate networks of complex systems, Jake saw them as tools, each with a purpose. It was the same way he viewed anything, whether it was a spaceship engine or a broken piece of equipment. Machines, no matter how advanced, were all built to serve a purpose. They followed a pattern, even if that pattern was beyond the reach of the creators who built them. He knew that what they had missed wasn't a technical flaw or a missing component. It was a small mistake in their thinking. They were too focused on solving the puzzle with the logic that worked for them. But it wasn't the right approach. He didn't need to understand every piece of the alien technology to know how to fix it. All he needed was to think like a mechanic, and that was something no one had done before. As Jake worked, the council members and engineers grew more restless. His calm demeanor unsettled them. They were used to seeing beings like themselves, beings with thousands of years of experience, handle complex problems. But here was this human, working methodically, with nothing but his instincts guiding him. To the aliens, it was incomprehensible. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" one of the engineers finally asked. It was the same engineer who had mocked Jake when he first entered the room. His tone was sharp, impatient, and laced with doubt. "You're not even using the right tools. You don't understand the systems inside the weapon." Jake didn't look up from his work. His fingers paused for just a moment as he examined a particular panel. Then he continued his task. "I'm not using tools because I don't need to," he said, his voice steady. "I'm fixing it with my mind. You're too focused on the small details. Sometimes you just need to look at the big picture and trust your instincts." The words hung in the air for a moment. The alien engineer was about to say something more, but he stopped. For the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. What if this human was right? What if their approach had been too narrow? Maybe they were so caught up in their superior knowledge that they had missed something simple, something obvious. The other engineers began to look at each other, unsure. Could it be true? Could a human, with none of their advanced knowledge or experience, really see something they couldn't? They had been blind to the answer for so long, convinced that the problem lay in the complexity of the weapon. But what if, like Jake said, they had missed something simple? Jake's eyes narrowed as his fingers danced across a small console. He had been working for over an hour, yet he had not once doubted himself. He knew the answer was close. He could feel it. Then, with a soft click, the panel in front of him slid open, revealing a small, hidden compartment within the weapon's core. The room fell silent. The engineers stared at Jake in disbelief. What they had assumed was an error in their complex design was actually a simple oversight. A piece of the machine had been installed in the wrong place, disrupting the delicate balance of energy within the weapon. It was a tiny mistake, barely noticeable, but to Jake, it was the key to the entire problem. He reached into the compartment and carefully pulled out a small crystal, no bigger than the size of his hand. The crystal glowed with a soft, otherworldly light, its surface slick and smooth. It was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before, but in that moment, he understood exactly what it was. The crystal was the heart of the weapon's power core, and it had been misaligned. The energy it contained was powerful enough to destroy entire star systems, but without the proper alignment, it was nothing more than an unstable mass of energy. Jake smiled to himself, feeling the surge of pride. He had found the solution. In a way, it was almost laughable. The galaxy's best engineers had missed this, but Jake had seen it from the beginning. The weapon hadn't failed because of its complexity. It had failed because of a simple mistake that no one had bothered to consider. He carefully adjusted the crystal, placing it in its correct position. The weapon hummed to life, its energy level stabilizing. For the first time in hours, the glowing panels on the machine began to show a steady, balanced pulse. It was working again. Jake stepped back, wiping his hands on his uniform as he looked at the alien engineers. "There you go," he said, his voice calm but filled with quiet satisfaction. "It wasn't as complicated as you made it out to be." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the engineers slowly started to approach, their eyes wide with astonishment. They couldn't believe it. The human had done it. In one move, in less than 2 hours, he had done what none of them could. He had rebooted the weapon that was supposed to change the galaxy. He had made the impossible possible. The council members were still in shock, their eyes locked on Jake. They had expected failure, but instead, they had witnessed the brilliance of a human mind. A mind that had approached the problem not as an alien engineer would, but as a mechanic would. And in doing so, Jake had shown them all something they hadn't expected, that sometimes the simplest solution is the one that works. And this was only the beginning. The room was filled with silence as the weapon hummed back to life, its energy stabilizing, and its panels glowing with a soft but steady pulse. The alien engineers, once so confident in their ability to solve the problem, now stood in awe, their mouths slightly agape as they watched Jake's calm and steady movements. He had fixed it. A human, with no knowledge of their alien technology, had not only repaired the weapon but had done so with ease, using methods and instincts that no one had even considered. Jake stood back, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit, his face a mask of quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The room was still, the engineers hesitant to approach. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air, one they couldn't quite shake. How had he done it? How had a human, with nothing but his hands and his mind, managed to fix what the galaxy's finest engineers had failed to repair? The lead engineer, a tall and imposing figure named Sharek, was the first to break the silence. His voice was cautious, almost hesitant, as if unsure of what to say. You fixed it," he said, his eyes flickering between Jake and the weapon. "How did you do it?" Jake turned to face Sharek, his expression neutral, but there was a quiet confidence in his voice. "I did it the same way I do everything, by looking at the problem from a different angle. You were all too focused on the complex details, trying to understand every part of the technology. But sometimes, the simplest solution is the right one." Jarek blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of Jake's words. He had spent hours poring over the weapon systems, convinced that the problem was buried deep within its complex energy matrix. But Jake had come in, seen the problem, and solved it in a fraction of the time. Jarek didn't know whether to be impressed or humbled. Either way, he couldn't deny the truth in Jake's words. The answer had been simple, and they had all missed it. The rest of the engineers were now gathering around the weapon, studying the repaired panels and running diagnostics. They, too, were beginning to realize that the solution had been right in front of them the whole time. They had been so caught up in their advanced knowledge and complex theories that they had overlooked the basic principle that Jake had used. Sometimes, simplicity was the key. The council members, who had been watching from a distance, were equally stunned. They had expected failure, just like everyone else. They had believed that the weapon was beyond repair, that no one, especially not a human, could fix it. But Jake had done it, and in doing so, he had completely disrupted their understanding of what was possible. One of the council members, a woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "I don't understand," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is alien technology, far beyond anything your species has ever encountered. How did you fix it without even knowing how it works?" Jake turned to face her, his gaze steady but calm. "It's true that I didn't understand the technology, but I didn't need to. I've worked with machines my entire life. Whether it's human technology or alien technology, all machines are built to do something. They have a purpose, and if you understand the basic principles of how they work, you can figure out what's wrong with them." The council member frowned, clearly struggling to grasp what Jake was saying. "But the complexity, how can you fix something so complex without knowing how it works?" Jake shook his head. "You're thinking of it the wrong way. The more you focus on the complexity, the more you lose sight of the basics. Every machine is just a collection of parts, each one working in harmony to serve a purpose. When something goes wrong, it's usually because one of those parts is out of place. I didn't need to understand every piece. I just needed to find the one thing that was wrong and fix it. The council member stood still for a moment, her mind racing. Jake's approach was so different from anything she had ever considered. It was simple, almost too simple. But as she thought about it, she realized there was truth in what he said. Machines weren't just a series of incomprehensible systems. They were tools. And tools, no matter how advanced, could be understood and fixed. Jarek, who had been listening intently, finally spoke again. "You've shown us something important, human. Something we failed to see ourselves." He paused, his tone softer now, almost respectful. "You didn't try to master the complexity of the technology. Instead, you worked with the basics, the fundamentals. You didn't let your ego get in the way of seeing the truth, and that's something we could all learn from." Jake nodded, his face betraying the hint of a smile. Sometimes, the most advanced solution is the simplest one. It's not about how much you know. It's about how well you can apply what you know. As the engineers and council members continued to examine the now fully operational weapon, there was a shift in the air. They had all witnessed something extraordinary. Jake had done what none of them had been able to do. He had fixed their failure. And he had done it not through superior intellect or advanced technology, but through a simple, human approach that relied on patience, intuition, and a willingness to look beyond the complexity. The weapon, once a symbol of failure, now stood as a testament to the power of human ingenuity. And in that moment, the alien engineers and council members began to realize something else. Humanity, with its unassuming nature and simple tools, had just proven that sometimes the greatest power lay not in complexity, but in the ability to see the world for what it truly was. But this was only the beginning. What they had witnessed was not a fluke, and Jake was not just a one-time miracle. The truth was, humanity had something far more powerful than advanced technology or ancient wisdom. They had the ability to think outside the box, to break free from the constraints of conventional thought, and to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. And as the weapon hummed steadily in the background, a new sense of respect began to grow among the aliens. They had seen what humans could do, and they realized that they had only just scratched the surface of what was possible. The question now wasn't whether or not humans could be part of their galaxy's future. It was how much of that future would be shaped by the very species they had once underestimated. As the last of the engineers filed out of the room, their heads still spinning with disbelief, Jake stood alone in front of the weapon. Its panels now hummed with a quiet power, the glow of its energy a reminder of just how far the galaxy had come in its pursuit of knowledge and control. Yet, despite the advanced technology surrounding him, Jake felt no awe. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the power of the weapon or the ingenuity of the alien engineers, but he knew something they didn't. None of this mattered if they couldn't see the simplest truths right in front of them. The silence was deafening in the room, broken only by the soft hum of the machinery. Jake leaned against one of the walls, crossing his arms, his mind racing through the series of events that had brought him here. When the aliens had first invited him to work on their weapon, they had been skeptical. They had seen humans as primitive, incapable of grasping the complexities of their technology. And why wouldn't they? The humans' own technology was still in its infancy compared to what the aliens had achieved. But here he was, having fixed something no one else could. The weapon was now working perfectly, far beyond what its creators had hoped. And the aliens had no idea how it happened. They had seen only the end result. They hadn't understood the process, the small, seemingly insignificant steps that led to the solution. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Jarek, the lead engineer, standing in the doorway. His posture was stiff, but there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Jake knew what it was. It was respect. Respect for the human who had just turned their world upside down. "Jake," Jarek began, his voice quieter than usual. I don't know what to say." Jake turned to face him, pushing off the wall. "You don't have to say anything. It's not about words. It's about understanding what we've all been missing." Jarek didn't reply immediately, But he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake. "You've done something incredible," he said, his tone more earnest now. "But I still don't understand how you did it. This technology is so far beyond anything humanity has ever known. How could you possibly fix it?" Jake paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "The more you try to understand something, the more you risk complicating it. I didn't try to master this technology. I just looked for the simple answer, the part that was out of place, the one that was throwing everything off balance." Jarek nodded slowly, as if the idea was just beginning to take root in his mind. "You didn't try to control it. You just saw it for what it was." "Exactly," Jake said with a half-smile. "Sometimes, you don't need to know everything. You just need to know what's wrong. Once you see that, the rest is easy." There was a long silence between them. Jarek was lost in thought, clearly struggling to reconcile the implications of what Jake had done. To an alien race that prided itself on its intellect and technical prowess, the idea of fixing something by ignoring its complexity was almost absurd. It went against everything they had ever believed. But Jarek knew one thing for sure. Jake had done it. The weapon was fixed. They had all watched it happen. And in that moment, something in Jarek's mind shifted. He had been wrong about humans. They weren't primitive or simple. They were something else entirely. They had a different way of thinking, one that was almost impossible for his kind to understand. "I think I see now," Jarek said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "You didn't come here to show us how much smarter you were. You came here because you knew we had missed something. You saw it from a perspective we couldn't even begin to imagine." Jake shrugged. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what needed to be done." Jarek took another step closer, his eyes now filled with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "You say you didn't do anything special, but that's not true. What you did was remarkable. And it makes me wonder, if you could fix this weapon, what else could humans do?" Jake glanced at the weapon again, its panel still glowing with the quiet pulse of energy. "That's a good question," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "But I don't know the answer. All I know is that sometimes we humans get underestimated. We're not as advanced as you, but we know how to think outside the box. And that's something that can't be measured by technology or intellect alone." Jarek remained silent for a long time, his gaze drifting back to the weapon. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You've opened my eyes, Jake, and I believe you've opened the eyes of many others here as well. Maybe it's time we started to think about things differently. Maybe it's time we stopped seeing humans as primitive." Jake smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I don't want to change how you see us, but I do hope you start to see that there's more to humanity than meets the eye." The two of them stood in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Jake wasn't sure if the aliens would ever truly understand the depth of what he had done. They had always relied on their advanced technology and superior intellect, believing that their way was the only way. But Jake knew something they didn't. It wasn't about the technology. It wasn't about how many gadgets or weapons you had. It was about the ability to think, to see solutions where others saw only problems. As Jarek turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Jake," he said quietly, "for showing us that there's more to fixing things than just knowledge. There's wisdom in simplicity, and perhaps that's something we all need to learn." Jake nodded, watching as Jarek walked away. He knew that this moment was only the beginning. The aliens had seen something they hadn't expected. They had seen the power of human ingenuity, and the spark of a new kind of respect was beginning to form in their minds. The question was no longer whether or not humans had a place in the galaxy. The question was how much of that place would be shaped by the very species that the galaxy had once underestimated. And as Jake looked at the weapon, now fully operational and standing as a testament to human resourcefulness, he couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when humanity's hidden potential was no longer a secret? The next day, the galaxy felt different. The quiet hum of excitement was palpable across the alien shipyard, a place that had long been a fortress of invincible technology and intellectual dominance. But today there was a shift in the air. Humans were no longer just the visitors from a primitive world. They were now the catalyst for something far bigger than anyone had ever imagined. And Jake felt that weight pressing on him as he walked through the sprawling corridors of the facility, the echoes of his footsteps reminding him of the monumental change he had helped bring about. The aliens were still trying to wrap their heads around the events of the previous day. The engineers, once so sure of their technological superiority, were now scrambling to comprehend what had happened. They had seen Jake walk into the workshop with nothing but a fresh set of eyes, and in a matter of hours, he had turned everything upside down. He hadn't just fixed the weapon. He had done something far more profound. He had shown them a new way of thinking, one that they hadn't even considered before. As Jake moved through the hallways, he saw the familiar faces of the alien engineers and technicians, their expressions a mix of confusion, awe, and in some cases, grudging respect. They had all witnessed his achievement, but none of them fully understood how it had been done. The truth was, Jake had simply looked at the problem from a different angle, something that, in the world of advanced technology, was almost considered a weakness. But he knew better. Sometimes it wasn't about applying more knowledge or complexity. Sometimes it was about simplicity. It was about taking a step back and asking the question, what if we're looking at this all wrong? As Jake entered the main conference room, he was greeted by Jarek, the lead engineer who was waiting for him by the door. Jarek's posture was still stiff, but his eyes held a new light, one that hadn't been there before. Jake could see that the alien had come to a realization, though it was clear that the full extent of it was still settling in. Jake, Jarek began, his voice steady but carrying an unusual sense of respect. I've been thinking about everything you did yesterday. You didn't just solve a problem. You changed the way we think about problems altogether. Jake gave a small nod, his eyes scanning the room where several other engineers stood, awaiting his input. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what I had to do to make the system work. Jarek's expression remained serious, but there was a hint of something softer beneath the surface. That's where you're wrong. What you did was extraordinary. The rest of us were so consumed by the complexity of the problem that we couldn't see the simple solution right in front of us. And that's why we failed. He paused for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. But you found the answer in a way we never could. Jake didn't know what to say at first. He had always believed that the answer was never about having more knowledge or better technology. It was about finding the right questions to ask. The aliens had been trying to force the problem into a mold that didn't fit, overcomplicating things until they lost sight of the most basic solution. But Jake had been different. He didn't try to force the weapon to work the way they wanted it to. He simply allowed the machine to show him what was wrong, and then found the simplest way to fix it. He glanced around the room, noting the skeptical stares of the other engineers. They were trying to come to terms with what Jake had done, and some of them still weren't convinced that it wasn't a fluke. But Jake wasn't concerned about that. In time, they would all understand. I've been thinking, Jarek continued, his voice quieter now. Perhaps we've been going about things the wrong way for a long time. Maybe the way we approach problems, our need to control every aspect of our technology, has blinded us to other possibilities. You've shown us that sometimes the solution isn't about imposing our will. It's about understanding the simplicity of what's in front of us. Jake smiled, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. He had seen this moment coming. It was the point in the story where the humans began to realize that they were different, that they had something the other species lacked. But it also made him wonder, could they learn to embrace that difference? Or would they be content to let their egos blind them to the potential they had unlocked? We all have something to learn, Jarek, Jake said, his voice calm but firm. The galaxy doesn't have all the answers, and neither do we. But if we work together, if we stop looking at each other as superior or inferior, We can create something better than any one species could do alone. Jarek looked at Jake, his expression softening. For the first time, Jake could see a genuine understanding in the alien's eyes. It was as if a door had opened, one that allowed Jarek to see the humans not as primitive beings, but as valuable contributors to something much larger than they could ever have imagined. "I'll take your words to heart," Jarek said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Perhaps it's time we rethink the way we've been operating. Perhaps it's time we stop thinking that we have all the answers. Maybe the universe doesn't work that way." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges and doubts, and there would always be those who couldn't see past their own pride. But for the first time, Jake felt like the galaxy might finally be ready to listen. And that gave him hope. As the meeting continued, Jake spoke with the engineers and shared his thoughts on how the weapon could be improved even further. But deep down, he knew that the real victory wasn't in the technology. It was in the change of mindset he had sparked. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. They had shown that sometimes it wasn't about knowledge or technology. It was about the wisdom to see the simplicity in the chaos. And that, Jake realized, was the greatest weapon of all.